Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very senior and accomplished professional from the USA, Dr. Elia Gourgouris. He's a Ph.D. Elia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. And Happy New Year to you too.
Thank you, and to you. Dr. Gourgouris is the president of the Happiness Center, which is an organization of world-leading experts in the field of positive psychology. He's the founding partner of the Global Institute of Thought Leadership. He's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of several books titled 7 Paths to Lasting Happiness, 7 Keys to Navigating a Crisis, a practical guide to emotionally dealing with pandemics and other disasters. So, Elia, before I get into talking about the Happiness Center, let me ask you to tell me about your own journey and what encouraged you to pursue happiness as a career.
Thank you so much. Actually, people say, how did you become the happiness doctor? What is the story behind that? Because that's a very unique thing. When people ask me, you travel, you're in airplanes, so what do you do? I'm a happiness expert. And they're like, what? So believe it or not, the happiness brand began the very day I was born. Now, this might be very hard to believe, but I was born a very long time ago, like you were in the same decade, in the old country in Greece. And back in those days, nobody was invited in the birthing room. There was no cameras. There was no Facebook Live. There was no
Correct.
So as the story was told, it was just my mom and the doctor and the nurse, right? But as the story was told with me growing up, my dad shows up, kind of a tough guy, tough old school Greek guy, smoking a cigar and drinking all that stuff. And he asks the nurse, and there was a little window. There were 5 little babies. We're all wrapped up in our light white generic blankets back in the day. Everybody was the same, right?
Yeah.
So my dad goes, which one is my son? And I guess at that point, I had a big smile on my face. And the nurse turns to my dad and says, your son, he's the happy one. And that was my brand, right? So I grew up in a family that's like, well, you came out of the womb happy. You've always been happy, happy-go-lucky, and so on. And people that have known me for decades can attest to that I've been, for the most part, a very positive human being. Now, here's the funny part. Fast forward 25 years. Now, I'm in graduate school. I'm getting my Ph.D. in clinical psychology. And the professor is talking to us about nature versus nurture. In other words, what makes us who we are? Is it our DNA, our genetic predisposition, or is it our environment that makes us who we are? And of course, we both know that there's a combination of the two. And I had this terrible thought. I'm like, wait a minute. What if my dad shows up like 15 minutes late? He's got caught up in traffic, comes up to the same windows, the same nurse asks the same question. And at that point, I'm having stomach pains and my face is all red and I'm screaming my head off. And the nurse turns to my dad and goes, your son, he's the cranky one. And therefore, I'm raised, my family, you came out of the womb cranky, you miserable little beep, So why do I share this story? Because I think we've all been branded one way or another. If you look back at our early lives, it typically happens in our family.
Yeah.
We were branded. Now, the happiness brand is a wonderful, positive brand. And there are other ones like that are positive, like the smart one, the princess, the intellectual one, the athletic one, the creative one, and so on. These are wonderful brands. And if you've been branded like that early on in your life, count your blessings. However, in my experience, both as a clinical psychologist and just an international keynote speaker, traveled all over the world and spoken in front of thousands of people and interviewed people and so on. Unfortunately and sadly, far too many people have been branded negatively. And I love that your show is all about, what the brand called you, right? And I will tell you in my informal statistics, the top 3 negative brands are, and these are horrific names. I want you to know that, are the ugly one, the stupid one, or the fat one.
Wow.
No, I know. And this is serious now. This isn't funny at all. So several years ago, I'm giving a talk in North Carolina at a group of 500 women. And I'm sharing the story about your personal brand. And the point of the story is, if you don't like your negative brand that you've inherited, today's the day to empower yourself and to choose a different brand. Like we can, as adults now, we have the free agency to choose for ourselves a different brand than what was assigned to us when we were young. So as I'm giving this talk, out of the corner of my eye, this elderly lady stands up, white hair, in her 70s, and starts waving her arms. And it kind of threw me off a little bit because I'm doing my thing, my keynote, I'm in the middle of that, but I couldn't ignore her. The audience is looking at her. I'm looking at her. So at some point I stopped my talk and I'm like, yes, ma'am. And her name was Leah, her first name. She goes, after listening to you, Dr. Elia, I want to change my brand. And she said, like, listen to this. For the last 70 plus years, I have been called ugly, fat, and stupid, and then a couple of expletives.
Wow.
So when she said that, I froze a little bit. I mean, you could hear a pin drop. It was silence. The whole room was silent. They're looking at me. I'm looking at her. It took me like a few seconds just to recover. And I'm like, well, ma'am, I'm sorry to hear that, but what would you like your new brand to be? And at this point, she turns to me and she goes, well, from now on, I want to be known as Princess Leia, and kind of like Star Wars. Wow. So I looked at him like, yes, Your Majesty. And I bowed down to her, yes, Your Majesty. And a very tense moment became a very lighthearted moment. And everybody started to laugh. And then I went back to do my thing. Why do I share this story? Because to me, this lady is an inspiration. If a lady that's been on this earth for 70 plus years can change her brand, then anybody can do it.
Absolutely.
So that's a long answer to a short question, but this is the background. This is where I come from.
And this is such a powerful comment you've just made in the last few minutes on how we can all change our brand. But I think the important thing is if you decide to make a change, you've got to sustain it.
Right.
But let's now talk about the Happiness Center. Let me start by asking you, how do you define happiness? Because happiness means different things to different people.
I'm going to plagiarize a little bit and go back to the great Greek philosopher Aristotle, who 2,500 years ago said, happiness is the whole purpose and meaning of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Now, think about what he just said 2,500 years ago. To me, that encapsulates everything. To me, happiness is the most important thing in our lives.
Correct.
And I will, I guess to validate that some, when I travel, wherever I travel throughout the world, I always start my talks by asking the audience the following question. And I say this: if you were a parent, regardless of your nationality, ethnicity, religious affiliation, socioeconomic status, gender affiliation, whatever you want to do, if you ask those parents, what would you like for your children? What is the answer to that question? I just want them to be, and then I take the mic and I stick it to the audience, and they're all like, happy. So that is a universal thing. Everyone that loves somebody, especially their children or grandchildren, what do they want from them? To be healthy and happy. That's it.
Well said. Well said. My next question to you is that what are the factors that could influence our happiness negatively?
There's several factors. And I'm going to start with, I think, lack of self-forgiveness. Mahatma Gandhi said, forgiveness is the attribute of the strong.
Correct.
Which I love that statement. And I would add to that self-forgiveness equals freedom. And self-forgiveness leads to happiness. Now, as a clinical psychologist, I work with a lot of people, especially in addictions and so on, who struggle with their self-worth and self-esteem. And even after they healed and they were sober for quite a while, and we went through the 12 steps of recovery and so on, I would have one last interview with them. And I would ask them, do you feel like your significant other, your spouse, has forgiven you? Yes. Your children? Yes. Your business associate? Yes. And so on. God, whatever. Yes. The last question was, have you forgiven yourself?
Right.
Guess what the answer was to that? The best answer I ever heard was, I'm working on it. But most often I would hear, no, I haven't. So I think self-forgiveness to me is the most self-compassionate thing we can do. So that's one thing that lack of self-forgiveness, of course, impacts greatly. I think externally, if we surround ourselves with toxic relationships and toxic people, I don't care how much self-care you do, how much you do, and I speak to that specifically in relationship. It's very hard to maintain your inner peace and happiness if you're surrounded with toxicity. So I have a process that I made a conscious decision about 17 years ago that I did not want to have any toxic relationships in my life, and I don't have it. And people say, "Oh, you got to be exaggerating. How is that possible?" But it is possible. And the process that I take people through about specific toxic relationship is the following. First of all, it starts about how I show up in relationships.
Correct.
So if I show up in my relationship with you as friends, and I treat you with love, kindness, and respect, I have every right to expect that you, in turn, will treat me with love, kindness, and respect. I mean, if I show up like a jerk, I can't expect you to treat me with love, kindness, and respect. Right. But if I do my part, I guess is what I'm saying, then I expect you to do the same. And if you don't, you and I are going to have a discussion. And my first question to you is, do I treat you with love, kindness, and respect? Yes or no? And if you say, yes, you do, then I'm like, well, I expect the same in return. And if you don't do that, our relationship is going to suffer. And at some point, I'm going to end this relationship until you are loving, kind, and respectful back to me. So that's how. Now people say, well, what about if it's a member of my family? Even with them, that's true. And I've done it in my own extended family and so on. And it does work. You have to stick to your guns, though. Correct. And part of that is what I call having the acronym HOT communication. It stands for honest, open, and transparent. And hopefully you do it from a place of love, because you can have hot communications and be, let me give you some feedback and then hit somebody with a 2x4 over the head. Brutally, let me be brutally honest with you. And really the attempt of that is to hurt them. I'm talking about having hot communication with people, but doing it from a place of love. And when you do that, people not only receive your feedback, but they're like, it's so refreshing, actually. I try to practice hot communication, not just with my family, extended family, clients, and patients, with the customer service agents on the phone, with everybody. The person at the grocery store, loving, kind, and respectful to them. And because I'm Greek, I have a great sense of humor, and I use a lot of humor and lightheartedness, because we take ourselves far too seriously in this life. You know that. Most of us do.
Absolutely. My next question to you, and that's, your last comment gives me an interesting segue to the next question, which is, how does culture impact happiness? There are some cultures which are extremely happy, like you just mentioned, I'm Greek, and therefore I have a sense of humor. There are some other cultures where happiness is not considered to be something which is so positive. I'd love to get your perspective on the impact of culture.
Yeah, I think different cultures have their strengths, and even the Greeks. I'm very proud of my heritage. Like in India, I mean, we're ancient cultures. We go back thousands and thousands of years. Absolutely. Lots of wisdom, lots of trials, lots of ups and downs, and so on. And I respect and I adore culture. We raised our children. We travel a lot. That's one of our. Rather than buying our kids gifts, our kids are growing and grandkids and so on. But the kids basically. We want them to become world citizens, meaning that as we travel, we wanted them to appreciate different cultures, the architecture, the food, the language, just the way of being. Correct. Because all these cultures are different, but they have their pluses and minuses. I mean, even the Greeks have their minuses. It's not like we have a perfect culture. There is no perfect culture.
Absolutely.
So I don't focus as much as the culture. I focus more on the individual, to be honest with you.
Correct.
And in a system, I work with senior leaders and organizations and so on, and try to create cultures of happiness and wellness within those organizations. So I can't say that I'm an expert in the cultures in terms of ethnicity or nationality. So I don't go that far out.
Fair enough. So is there any way for us to measure happiness and the well-being associated with happiness?
Absolutely there is. As a matter of fact, I created a happiness survey several years ago. And when I work with people, I have them take it up front before we even meet. Like with clients, I'm like, here, take this assessment. I call it a personal health assessment in essence, that looks at your physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being. And, and the only requirement is really, it's not a test, it's an assessment. And then, I work with them, and then I have them take it again 6 months afterwards, and we measure the numbers. Like, let's say you got a score of 65 before, now you have a score of 83. So it's measurable. And the personal health assessment gives me a lot of data. And by the way, this is a side note, I take my own personal health assessment on the 1st of every month. Every month, it's almost like taking my pulse, right? Because I also want to see, how am I doing this month? Maybe there's some areas of, maybe physically I'm doing great, but I'm literally struggling a little bit emotionally or mentally. I need to know that, right? And then for the following 30 days, what am I willing to do about this specific question? Because all 20 of these questions leads to health and happiness. And there's a scale of 1 through 5. Obviously, if you score 4s and 5s, that's great. If you score a 3, which means sometimes it's not a bad score, but it means there's room for improvement. But if you score yourself a 1 or a 2, one means basically I do nothing in that area, or a two is like I rarely do it. Those are red flags, because I promise you, if you score anywhere a one or a two, that detracts from your well-being, it detracts from your happiness, and it detracts from your health. So therefore, when I see a score like that, when I begin coaching somebody, we focus on that. How can we get the ones and the twos to at least a three, like a sometimes you're doing it, with the ultimate goal being to score as many fours as you can. Fives are perfection. There are very few questions we can answer five. There's some, but like, what is your purpose in life? Do you know your purpose in life? Well, for me, I do know what my purpose in life is, which is to leave this world a better place than I found it. It's a very simple one, in whatever form that is, right? But a lot of other questions, fours are great. That's the goal. And that's how, and so there are metrics associated with it.
Fascinating. So now let me move to your book, 7 Paths to Lasting Happiness.
Yes.
Before you tell me about your book, is it available on Amazon and other platforms?
It is indeed. And, by the way, I wrote both of those books from my heart, not as a Ph.D. Like it was, and the first book, especially the happiness book, was a life's work. My 30 years of working with people as a psychologist and as a coach. It was, I poured my heart into it. And when you've written 8 books, going on number 9, the very first time you write a book, it's almost like writing a song, and you don't know if the audience is going to boo you off stage or they're going to embrace you. Correct. And to my astonishment, when it became a #1 bestseller here in the United States, and then got translated into 4 or 5 languages, I was amazed. I was blown away. But you know why? Because people have said, like, Elia, it's not like you've said something that nobody has said for the last 2,000-3,000 years. But what we like about what you said is that at the end of every chapter, you have a couple of points for the reader to ponder, to think about, to consider, a couple of questions to answer. But then the most important thing is what I would call take action. Because in life, and you know this more than anybody else, it doesn't matter what we know. What matters in life is what do we do with what we know. I can go out and read the top 10 books on happiness and highlight them and underline them to death. And then I put them back on the bookshelf behind me, right? Never to read it again. Well, now I know more about happiness, but I'm not any happier because I'm not doing anything different. As a matter of fact, I think I'm more frustrated because I have more knowledge, but my life hasn't changed any, right? So what matters in life, what do you do with what you know?
And in your book, The 7 Paths to Lasting Happiness, would you be able to share a few of these paths that you have outlined?
I can share very quickly, and then if we have time to go into more detail, one of them we already talked about, which was forgiveness. So that, that's number 3. The first one really is self-love or self-care.
Yeah.
Like, really, how do we take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually? It has to start with that. The second one has to do with gratitude. And we all know that having an attitude, you cannot be grateful and depressed at the same time physiologically in the brain, because when we're grateful, there's certain chemicals that are released. The question, of course, with gratitude is this. And I share that we are all graduates, all of us, every human being, from the University of Adversity, right? And the older we get, the more adversity we have faced, and the higher the degrees that we have. The question then being, when things are going well, it's very easy to be grateful. I can do this in my sleep. I can write a journal of gratitude all day long and never get tired. But can we be grateful when we face adversity, when things do not work out or are difficult in our lives? Yep. And I'm here to tell you that absolutely. And I will go to the great Nelson Mandela, who once said that in life, either you win or you. So as long as I learn something from my adversity, that counts as a win, actually. And therefore, I'm grateful. You and I have had good successes in our lives. We've done pretty well. I mean, we're successful, by the world standard and so on. But I've learned the most important lessons I've ever learned was from my failures. When things did not work out, when it was painful, right? Because that pain actually forced me to go outside of my comfort zone. Which, when things are going well, why would I leave my comfort zone? It's comfortable. I like staying there, right?
Absolutely. Great response. Thank you.
Yeah. So
please go ahead.
Knowing your purpose in life. I think people that know their purpose in life and live their purpose tend to be happier. Obviously, having healthy and joyful and positive relationships. Again, we talked about the toxic relationships that we need to eliminate. I think feeding your spiritual self, and that's not a religious necessarily chapter or path, but it's like, I believe that we're spiritual beings and there's a spiritual mind, body, spirit connection. So to feed that. And the seventh one is actually kindness. And I believe that happiness and kindness are interconnected. You can't have one without the other. Happy people by nature perform acts of kindness of service all the time. Why? Because their batteries are full. On the flip side, when we perform an act of kindness or service towards another human being, something happens inside of us that makes us happy. So, those are the seven paths right there.
Fascinating. Thank you. I have time for only one more question, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey as the happiness doctor, and I love what you mentioned about how you were a smiling baby when your father asked for it. That's an amazing story. What would you say, Elia, are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your own journey and from our conversation?
I think to be flexible and adaptable in life.
Yeah.
When we get older, there's a certain saying that, old people are kind of set in their ways.
Yeah.
Well, this is who I am. I'm not going to change now.
Correct.
I have chosen a different philosophy to say that the older I get, the more flexible and adaptable I want to be. I want to learn from the millennials. I want to learn from my children's generation. I want to learn from younger people. I want to be more open, less stuck in my ways, less set in my ways, because if I stop growing, I'm dying. So for me, being flexible and adaptable and open-minded is the key to happiness and success. So that is one thing, that's a very specific thing. The second thing, I believe that we're all navigating life. We're all navigators to some degree, right? And how do we navigate life successfully? Right? I think that, and the world is going through such difficult times over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, devastating. Mental health, the mental health tsunami and crisis globally is unprecedented. According to the United Nations, now we have billions and billions of people suffering from depression, anxiety, PTSD, and so on.
Yeah.
So the question is, how can we navigate these challenges that we're facing? And self-care is not selfish. Self-care is mandatory. And I have personally, I've practiced more self-care in the last 2 or 3 years than I ever have in my entire life. I'm in better place right now, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually than I was 20 years ago.
Correct.
And that may sound strange to you, but I've invested more than I've ever had before in my life, because the older we get, I mean, to me, it's a non-negotiable anymore.
Correct.
I'm going to go for my walks every day for an hour or more than that. I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to try to get better sleep. I'm going to connect deeply in my relationship with people and practice hot communication and express gratitude and so on. Those are no longer like, it would be nice to have them, but I just don't have time to do that anymore. No, you live in the present and you live now, because the beauty about the pandemic, even though it's been devastating, is there are no guarantees about tomorrow.
Correct. That's a big realization.
And as a result of that, that gives us the freedom to live our best lives now. And my last and biggest takeaway, to piggyback on that, is because people have said, after I wrote the book and I started speaking, like, what's your biggest takeaway from this global catastrophe that has happened? I said, my biggest takeaway is this: do not procrastinate your happiness. Because most of us say, I'll be happy when I retire, or when the kids are out of the house, or when I'm in the right relationships, or when I get this raise, or forget all the whens. Happiness now. Do not procrastinate your happiness. That's my biggest takeaway.
Amazing. And on that note, Elia, and your 3 amazing lessons: be flexible and adaptable and open-minded. Second, you said was that self-care is mandatory in order to be able to navigate our life successfully. And third one, which is such a powerful comment: do not procrastinate on your happiness. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Every time you were talking about different aspects of how you have changed, I was almost hearing myself speaking, because I believe in exactly everything that you have spoken about. Thank you for speaking to me about the Happiness Center, about hot communication, which is something I learned from you today, which is honest, open, and transparent communication, which is so critical. Thank you also for talking to me about forgiveness, about self-love and self-care. Finally, thank you for talking to me about your book and for taking the time to speak to me. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much. And may I add one last thing? I just thought about it. most people talk about what is your mindset? And although my mindset is really important, I've moved beyond that a little bit to say, where's your heart set? Like, where's your heart set? And I don't even know if that's a word, heart set. I know mindset is a word, but listen to your heart, trust your intuition, trust yourself, and then move to action, and you'll have a wonderful life and a happy life. Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your time.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.